Healthcare.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're joined by Ron and Justin from GoldSky Cybersecurity Solutions, and would welcome you here today to talk about our compliance session. I think to begin with, maybe if you don't mind, Ron, introducing yourself.
Absolutely. And first and foremost, Danny, Craig, thanks for having us. We're excited to be partnered with you guys and talking about compliance without compromise. My name is Ron Frechette. I am the CEO here at GoldSky. CEO in our world stands for Chief Evangelist Officer. We try to get out and educate, transform, and protect, focusing on small and mid-sized businesses. So excited to be able to share some compliance frameworks with everyone today.
And Justin?
Thanks for having us today. I am the Chief Delivery Officer for GoldSky, and we do a lot of framework implementation, governance, remediations, and that's why we're here today to talk about what we do.
And Craig, do you want to give an introduction to yourself?
Sure. My name's Craig. I'm the Director of Threat Ops, which is ThreatLocker's new product, and excited to learn more about compliance.
So, and I'm Danny Jenkins, CEO of ThreatLocker. Mine does mean Chief Executive Officer, but it also means I get my hands dirty. I get to play around with security. I get to play around with breaking into systems, and I get to be involved in our product development as well. So I think what we want to do today is really just talk about challenges of compliance, because there's lots of acronyms out there. There's lots of standards out there, and no one really knows what they're doing. And there's lots of people who say they know what they're doing and really don't. So we want to try and break down what that means and hopefully answer some of your questions, so you know, what should I be doing to get compliant? Where do I need to get compliant? And what is the difference between compliance and security? Because while compliance is supposed to be driving security, they're not necessarily aligned. I saw a great picture actually on a slide deck someone was presenting recently, and there's a guy on a motorcycle with a helmet on, completely stark naked, and it says, this guy's compliant. So I think that was probably the best analogy, but helmet's good, but it doesn't necessarily mean you don't do other things as well.
That's Chase Cunningham's deck. I recognize that picture.
Yes, definitely. So maybe, Ron, if we hand over to you to begin with.
Absolutely. All right. So wanted to kind of start with the title of this webinar, which is Compliance Without Compromise, right? So compliance without compromise, it's really about integrating compliance into our company's core values, our processes and strategies, right? It means taking a proactive approach to compliance that not only meets the minimum requirements, but it goes beyond the minimum standards to ensure that our business is meeting the highest standards of integrity, transparency, and accountability, right? By adopting a mindset of compliance without compromise, organizations aim to build trust with their stakeholders, including clients, employees, investors, regulatory bodies, and it really demonstrates a commitment to ethical behavior, risk mitigation, responsible governance, while also fostering an environment conducive to innovation and growth. So that said, let's go ahead and jump right in. And Justin?
Yeah, so one thing I want to talk about before we leap into the various frameworks. It's very easy to look at compliance as a series of checkboxes, as we just talked about with the naked person with a helmet. Really, compliance is going to be something that if you have a solid security program, you're going to meet 90% of whatever framework is thrown at you. Really, it's just going to be like that extra 10% based on the industry you're in and the kind of things that you have to do. And the other nice thing, especially if there's a lot of IT managers here that may have been kind of lumped with security, and there's this whole business around you, and they're just putting on you and you're overworked already and you're trying to deal with that, is all of these frameworks require management to be involved, for there to be leadership that are providing you with the resources, the people, the money, the equipment that you need to be able to pull this off. So saying that, let's step into kind of the big granddaddy of it all, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who make the rules for absolutely everything. And they sit there and they come up with these big lists of controls, and we tend to focus on the SP 800s, which is all of the technical stuff, cybersecurity. They've just released a framework for AI. They have their cybersecurity framework, the risk management framework. But really where all this comes from is the SP 853 Rev 5, which is a catalog of a couple of thousand controls. And most of the frameworks are going to be drawn from that. That big catalog just gives you everything from very low security guidelines all the way up to super secret squirrel levels of security. So let's talk about the different types of frameworks that are out there. And we split these out into two things. On our left-hand side here, we've got regulatory frameworks. What does that mean? That means if you do something wrong, they're going to fine you. If they come in and take a look at you, there's a breach. Yeah, you are contravening a law. So on that side, we've got healthcare with HIPAA, we've got FISMA for federal, GLBA for finance, GDPR for European privacy. And when we look at the New York Shield Act, that's really there as a representative of the fact that we have about 30 states right now that are implementing new regulatory rules, mostly around privacy, but cybersecurity is starting to come in there. On the right-hand side, we have what we're calling business boosters. PCI, if you're handling credit cards, the credit card companies want to make sure that you have a good level of security so you don't lose cardholder data. You've got FedRAMP and CMMC. Those are if you want to work in the federal space. FedRAMP for cloud providers, CMMC if you are working with defense contractors, you're going to need that. And then we have North America, SOC, which I'm sure most of you have heard of, SOC 2 being the most popular. And then ISO, if you're doing international business, the International Standards Organization, 27001 is the most popular you'll see in this space. Ron.
Yes, sir. So as it relates to CMMC, which is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program, again, if we go to the mothership, the controls that are included within the CMMC framework are what we call NIST SP 800-171. So if you look at NIST 800-171, there's 110 controls that are in scope. If you are interested, or if you're working with either federal contractors or agencies direct, you're gonna, I think June is the drop dead date where this is now going to be mandated, so that if you're looking at a request for proposal and you want to bid on it, there's probably going to be something in there that says that you need to be level 2 CMMC certified. And this is where a majority of our clients are coming in to get certified. But there's actually 3 levels. The first level is really foundational. There's 17 controls, or what they call practices, that are in scope. And that's for, again, any business that's either doing business with a federal contractor or directly with the Department of Defense. And then under this level 2, again, we've got 110 controls. And depending on, excuse me, if this is controlled unclassified information, is one of those acronyms that Danny mentioned at the top of the call. So it's all about CUI in the world of CMMC. So if you have non-prioritized CUI, you can actually self-attest. But if you're dealing with prioritized controlled unclassified information, you're going to have to engage with what they call a C3PAO, another acronym. And that is really an audit firm that will come in and do the attestation, and then that report will go to whoever, obviously your business, but also the agencies as well. Now, GoldSky, what we do, we are what they call a registered practitioner organization. So we're really the readiness guys. We don't really get into the audit space. We work with a lot of auditors and try to help their clients get ready for them to come in so that they pass their audits. And then level 3 is really kind of, this is when we're dealing with very highly sensitive information. And again, these assessments, if you have to use a C3PAO for that attestation, it's a triennial, whereas you should be doing annual self-assessments as a best practice anyways. So that's CMMC. Justin.
Yeah, so we already talked about HIPAA at the top there. Health information, that's what needs to be protected. And this goes back to 1996 when this regulation first came out, and it's undergone a lot of changes over time. The most recent would be 2009 when electronic personal health information was included for the first time, and anybody that is working with that information, even as a subcontractor, must meet the security rule. And you know, the danger here, and I'll tell you about a client that I had last year, legal firm dealing with personal injury lawyers, and they had no idea. So when we went in and we did their assessment, that was the first thing that we flagged for them, because they just hadn't realized that that is the law, and there are some pretty stiff penalties if you don't meet it, that can range into the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars.
I was just going to add that PHI in the cyber criminal world is highly sought after. And the main reason is the shelf life is typically a lot longer than, let's say, a credit card number with a PIN, because how often do we check our claims history versus how often do we check our credit card balance, right? So cyber criminals love protected health information, not only for the shelf life, but there's a lot of different things they can do with PHI, whether they sell it to another group that's going to monetize it on the dark web for PII purposes. So cyber criminals love PHI.
The security rules, do you mind expanding on that a little bit in terms of, obviously, the high-tech HIPAA Act security rules? How comprehensive is that compared to something like PSI security rules, or if we look at it, the NIST 800-171 framework?
It's fairly stringent. I mean, again, it's one of those things where somebody has to own the program in the management team. This is not something you can just push down for somebody else to own. It has to be documented. You have to have your technical controls, your governance controls. Because it's all written as a legal document, NIST publishes SP 866. There is a new revision coming out, which is more up to date. The current one has been around for at least 12 years. But yeah, I mean, it's a serious program. There's no cutting corners on it. It will cover everything you need to, because ultimately it's all about protecting that personal health information. And again, when you're looking at potential fines of $50,000 per issue and up, especially more so if you're doing it flagrantly and you understand you should be HIPAA and you don't have it, they can hit you for, I think, up to $250,000 per issue they find. So
yeah, the HIPAA security rule, Danny, talks about safeguards, right? So as Justin was saying, you've got administrative, technical, and physical safeguards. And on the administrative side, the first, I think it's 134A.I, says that you must conduct an annual security risk assessment, right? So again, these safeguards, if you look at NIST 866, they're very similar. So all NIST did was say, all right, let's take the HIPAA security rule and let's turn it into a special publication.
Are you guys aware of any cases of giant HIPAA fines?
We've seen people up in the millions, just in the last couple of years. Now, this is especially true because when it first came out, it was pretty toothless. There wasn't that much oversight, and the team weren't out there, you know, looking and finding people. I would say in the last 4 years, we've actually seen these bigger cases come through.
And then in 2009, when the HITECH Act came out, right, again, as Justin was mentioning, this brought, they were trying to convert everyone to electronic health records, right? So there was some meaningful use incentives. So as physician offices started converting over, they would actually get money for all of their eligible professionals. And then the other significant thing the HITECH Act did was bring business associates into scope for having to be HIPAA compliant, whereas before it was really only covered entities that needed to abide by the HIPAA law, right? So that would be a hospital, you know, anybody touching a patient, labs, those kind of things. And then when the HITECH Act came out, it said, all right, Now, any business that affiliates or does services for one of those covered entities must now be HIPAA compliant.
The HIPAA compliant, is there a certification for it, or is it a compliant? Is it self-attestation essentially?
Yeah, it's basically, it's a self-attestation. There is no, HIPAA compliance certification program. It's a law, right? It goes back to a regulation. Now, if you wanted to get healthcare cybersecurity certified, there's HITRUST, right? HITRUST has kind of come in, and they've almost become the PCI Security Standards Council, if you will, of the healthcare industry, right? Because the PCI Security Standards Council they are the voice of payment card security, whereas HITRUST is trying to take that same seat in the healthcare industry. So they've got a common security framework. You go through a certification program, and we are also a HITRUST readiness licensee. Again, you've got to be able to, or you got to work with the HITRUST Alliance in order to be able to help companies get ready for these certifications or be the attestation body that does the certification. All right, let's talk about SOC.
Yeah, there you go. So this was originally invented by accountants, but it's far more exciting than you'd think. The original, we're going to show on the next slide, there's a little table there, but this is a framework developed by people with glasses. There are 3 types of reports that are out there. The one that you're going to hear most often is SOC 2. And the reason we talk about SOC 2 is because that is your common criteria, which is your security criteria. There are other areas that you can include in your SOC report, but most first timers and even most companies that have moved forward have stayed with just that common criteria because it covers the GRC programs, management oversight, leadership involvement, and doing your due diligence. So as you can see there, we got the SOC 1, 2, and 3. SOC 1, throw it out, accounting. Unless somebody that's running QuickBooks comes to you and says they need something, you are all set. SOC 3 is a high-level attestation that you can use as a marketing piece. But again, we don't care. It costs money, ignore it. SOC 2, type 1, type 2. The nice thing about SOC is, we say what we do and we do what we say. So when we're looking at that, it's actually one of the few frameworks where you can go in and as long as you meet the COSO objectives that are listed out, you can create your own controls around it, which makes it incredibly flexible. And the value of your SOC 2, both from something that you can give a potential client, is that it allows them to see the security controls that you have in place to ensure that they align with your security posture. And on the other side, as I know, you're all doing a lot of third-party risk management every time you look to buy a new product. Same thing for you. You can ask them for a SOC 2, read through it, go through the controls section, and ensure that it aligns with your policies, procedures, and controls that you have in place. So you can make an informed decision.
I was just going to say there's 5 trust services criteria that you can attest to, right? Security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. So if you want, you can attest only to security just to get a SOC report and get the journey started. And then you can begin to mature your organization over time. Most of our clients will start with security and availability out of the gate, and then focus on these other 3 as they mature their programs.
Can you describe the difference between a SOC 2 type 1 and type 2?
Yeah, so a SOC 1 is a snapshot point in time. The assessor is going to come in.
Type 1, the SOC 2
SOC 2 type 1, I'm sorry, yes. Type 1, that's a snapshot in time. Do you have all the paperwork in place? So you're saying you do all this. The one that has the value is the SOC 2 type 2, and both ThreatLocker and GoldSky have their SOC 2 type 2s. That is evidence that all of the things that we said we were going to do occurred over the time frame of that audit. Now, those audit windows can be as short as 3 months. 6 months is another option. 1 year is kind of like the standard that most people will use, but those first SOC 2 type 2s generally fit in that 3 to 6 months, just so you have, again, you're able to show somebody that you have said you do this, and you have evidence that you do this, and now you have a report to hand out to somebody, and people have confidence that you're meeting those objectives.
It's all about operational effectiveness, right? Being able to show operational effectiveness in that SOC 2 Type 2 report. Whereas the SOC 2 Type 1, as Justin said, is kind of a point in time snapshot of these are the trust services criteria we're going to attest to. And then the auditors say, all right, that's great. You get that report. And then after a period of time, they come back, whether it's 3 or 6 months or a year, and then they say, all right, now you need to show us evidence that all of these trust services criteria that you told us were going to be in place are effective.
Exceptions in these reports, because one of the things that a lot of people I speak to said, I didn't know I was supposed to look for exceptions. And when I'm looking at a SOC 2 Type 2 report, I'm looking for 2 things. One is the security controls are what I want. So I want to see that they're using allow listing. I want to see that they've got advanced firewalls in place, because you don't have to have them to get a SOC 2 Type 2. Right. You have to have certain controls, but certainly not advanced security controls. So when you're looking at a SOC 2 Type 2 or SOC 2, check, do they have frameworks like allow listing and ring fencing? Do they limit outbound network traffic? Do they use encryption on their service? Because they're not necessarily required, but it will tell you the controls that they've implemented it. But then also look at the exceptions. And I don't think I've seen a report for a larger company that doesn't have some exceptions, including our own. And those exceptions could be as simple as someone who started didn't agree in the HR system to comply with the employment terms or something like that. Because I think that's what we got dinged on, because someone didn't click the button.
So the nice thing about this particular report is when there is a finding, you have the opportunity within that report as management to say why. You know, it's not just like you failed this one and it's bad. It's like you as management can turn around and say, yeah, this happened because of X, or this is now being tightened up. Again, which is why it's such a great business tool, because yeah, you can get into all those details, see exactly where things stand, see where the criticism was, but also see the immediate response from management as to how that has now been fixed.
Well, how's it being fixed, and what other controls mitigated the risk? So now, of course, you want to take what you find as whether it's serious or whether it's low impact. So if you go in and you say the SOC report requires all RDP traffic to be blocked or no inbound network connections to remote access, and it finds that they had 40 servers published on the internet with RDP, you start going, that's a big red alarm. And whatever the management says, it's got to be involving whiskey or something that made me make that mistake. Versus if you find, and the ones I tend to see is someone didn't complete, I remember looking, I think, actually, I probably shouldn't say the company, but one of the very big web hosting companies, and you can get, because you do sign NDAs when you read SOC reports, but it said that X number of employees hadn't completed their online training or something like that for cybersecurity in the sales department. So those kind of exceptions are likely to happen. I mean, you want to have them buttoned up, but equally, you get a big company that happens. But when you start seeing RDP open on the internet, then you start saying that's a bigger issue.
So if you think of SOC as your North American standard, that's kind of your 10,000 foot view that you then fill in your controls with. ISO is more your 5,000 foot view. This is actually one of my favorite frameworks. It's very well defined. You know exactly what you need to do. There is a huge part of ISO which is about governance, having the right information in place, having meetings, having leadership involved, and then there's a bunch of technical controls that get filled out as well on the side of that. So it's a great one if you want to do business internationally. It's also, if you don't have any compliance requirements, it's the one that I use to help companies understand what a comprehensive security program looks like, because ISO in itself is kind of like a big wibbly wobbly ball of security stuff. So everything relates to each other. So again, it breaks you out of that checklist mindset, which really can trip you up if you're just trying to do like one compliance thing. And we walk into clients time and time again that like needed to blow out like FedRAMP for something, and then they want to do another program, and like nothing fits because they didn't create a program. They check some boxes. So baseline, I love the ISO standard for that reason.
ISO certified versus ISO compliant. Well, compliant isn't a word in ISO because it's a standard. But what is the certification? Is it like a SOC 2 where they're validating?
It's
Are
very
they
simple.
validating the controls?
So the controls are prescribed within ISO. You don't get to make, so I don't want to say make them up. Whereas with SOC, like you said, as long as you're meeting the COSO objectives, you can create the controls and the evidence that you want to create. ISO is more prescriptive and says what needs to be in place. Now, there are maybe different ways to reach it, but it will say you have to have an information security policy. You must have meetings. Management must be shown to provide the resources and guidance. Your KPIs must align with your security objectives, which must be documented. So it's really good if you're like a novice and somebody says to you, build a security program, to look at that ISO 27001 standard, because it literally says on the page in very simple English with no messing around what you need to have in place to set that up.
And who can certify you?
It's called a certifying body, Danny. And so it does require an ISO accredited certifying body to go in and actually do the certification and the attestation work.
Okay.
So
very much like a SOC.
Yes.
There's a group of auditors you can use, and those auditors will allow it. Now, just one question on that, because we're obviously an international company too. We focused on the SOC 2 type 2 as well as other compliances, but we didn't focus on ISO certified. What's your experience when you trade internationally? If somebody asks for an ISO report and you give them a SOC report, are they generally accepting? I know what mine is, but what's your experience on this, and vice versa?
I would say SOC 2 is recognized in North America, carries a lot of weight. I would say it's very much going to be dependent on the company that you're working with outside of America, whether they're going to accept a SOC 2. If they have a big presence in the US, I'm sure it will be fine. If they are European based, they're going to put far more weight on that ISO certification, because it is so prescribed and says that you are doing things this specific way. Whereas like SOC 2 does give you that kind of general freedom, which is why it's such a great attestation to have, because it will fit any company from 3 guys in a garage all the way up to like 50,000 people working on something.
And then I would say in North America, Danny, the ISO certification is very well known, right? So anyone that's bringing an ISO 27001 certification to a company or potential vendor, client, what have you, in North America, they're going to absolutely recognize that.
So one of the things I found, it doesn't matter what you present to who, they always want you to fill in more questions. And those SIG reports, the 600 questionnaires with actually what type of locks you have on your Windows, for vendor onboarding forms to try and mitigate to say that they drilled in enough. And that's one thing I found. If you do have a company that works with SOC 2, a lot of these companies are self-serving. So SOC 2 Type 2 requires you to do a security review of your vendors that may have access to your data, which means I need to now, when I onboard a vendor, I say, hey, you're going to see access to certain data. I need to see your SOC 2 Type 2. And they say, oh, I don't have one. And then you have to mitigate that risk by putting a big questionnaire to them. And
that's right.
And then what happens is that company now says, do we need a SOC 2 Type 2? People keep asking for it. So both of these standards love to self-proclaim that they're the best and you need it for everything. So they're self-selling, if you like.
Yes, sir.
Seen that just in the last few years, where a lot of smaller companies are having to get their SOC 2 because these larger companies have started pushing down their security requirements.
All right, and I'll kick off the Q&A portion. While we wait for people attending the webinar to send their questions in, I'll present a question for discussion to you guys. So there's, let's see, we've got NIST, CMMC, SOC 2, HIPAA, and CIS. Implementing these inside your organization isn't free in terms of time and effort. How does a business go about deciding which one they should spend their time and effort following?
Sure. Well, again, if it's regulatory and you're in the industry, you don't have a choice. There's no free will here. You want to work in that industry. If you work in healthcare, you're working with healthcare information. Got to do HIPAA. Same if you want to work with federal contractors, CMMC is the way that things are moving forward. These are not choices. If you are in a situation where you don't have a specific compliance goal to start with, I always suggest that people start with the NIST cybersecurity framework. It is very well rounded. It's not overly complex. I mean, it's broken down into, like, I think we have a control set of like 72 different technical controls. And if people don't know what a control is, it's literally a question that says, do you have a firewall? So just imagine it's 70 questions that talk about that. Do you have an inventory? Very simple stuff, and it's yes, no, and sometimes maybe. So that's the best place to start, especially smaller teams, because it is flexible. You can look at it, but it does explain everything that you need. And again, it's not just about technical controls. And one of the things we see an awful lot of when we're doing the first kind of pass of with a client on a security risk assessment is very often they will nail all the technical stuff. Everybody knows, you know, don't click on links for phishing, have a firewall in place, make sure that you have antivirus. All of that stuff is just great. Where people are lacking 99% of the time is governance. And again, it's that understanding that leadership have to own security. It cannot be put down on like the overworked IT manager. There should be policies so your employees understand what the rules are. You know, there should be understanding of physical security. There should be understanding of the processes that you have there that have good controls. So the guy that's running the books can't also release the money. He's got to have like the CEO or the CFO hit the release button to make sure that there isn't any fraud. It's all really basic stuff. So that's where I would start. And this CSF is a great starter point. Unless you have a driver for SOC or ISO, but those are going to cost you money. And I think it's a lot tougher sell without that coming from leadership, because you're looking at, you know, anywhere between $20,000 and $70,000 to do those things.
Yeah, well, and I think the thing is with NIST, I'm a big fan of CIS, which wasn't put in here because I feel like they're very clearly defined controls.
Yes,
Yeah, you know what they are? The reason they didn't get included is one, we don't work a lot with them, but they have some great tools and they have things like baseline configuration standards. So there's a lot of prescriptive instructive things as opposed to things to test against. And I think that's
if you're giving it to an IT person versus a business person, sometimes a different framework works better, because certain people are just very technical. Give me a technical thing that I have to do. And some people are very, well, I need to comply with a policy and let me create this policy. I think there's also a difference between policy, because a lot of the, like, if we go through our SOC report, we say, well, there's a policy that there's a control that requires you have a policy, an access policy. So we have an access policy. And it's funny because when we went from non-SOC to SOC, our access policy went from this big to this big. Like it got much more complicated because now it became legal and binding. And we now have training on our access policy, which, because it's easier to do a training session. So we have the policy and then we have training. What does this mean? What's the right thing to do in this? And when you onboard at ThreatLocker, you go through, well, what are you allowed to do? What aren't you allowed to do? And then we test people on those, because if I just say sign this policy, everyone just signs a policy and says, yeah, okay. They go, well, I didn't know I couldn't do that. It's like, well, here's your signature, because they didn't read it. So when we put our policies in place, that complies with the requirement. But then what you want to do as a business is say, well, why do I have this policy and why is it important? And how do I force my employees to read this policy, which they're not going to do if you just give them a big policy, and then test them on it. So the way we do it internally is we have ThreatLocker University for our customers, but then we have ThreatLocker University for our staff. They go in and they say, these are your requirements and here's some questions to make sure that you actually paid attention to what we were saying to you. And then they have to answer yes to the question. So when they come back and say, I didn't know, say, yes, you did, because you answered the question correctly when you did the question. But also physical controls constraining people. I think, and this is where ThreatLocker comes in and helps, because it's very well and good to say, I'm going to tell all of my employees, do not install software on your machine, do not run programs, do not install Chrome extensions that you have not been authorized and permitted by the company. And that's what our policy says. It says, don't do this. But then you want to put physical controls where you can. Not everything can have a physical control. But sometimes you can have a physical control that says, okay, you can't run new software because when you try, it's going to pop up with a message saying, hey, this is blocked. You got to request it from your IT department. And when you're thinking about security versus compliance, quite often compliance talks about what's not allowed to happen in your environment and policies. And there are some physical controls as well. But think about, well, what can I do physically to stop bad things happening? Can I put restrictive software in place? Can I make users use dual factor authentication? So what can I do to overcome issues? Because you could say I have a policy that everyone goes into Office 365 and turns on dual factor. But if it's not physically enforced, I would like to say 20% of your staff, but I really mean 60% of your staff won't turn it on. So, so when you're building your security out, think about, here's my policy. How do I make sure it's being complied with?
What would be the top 3 controls that you could implement inside of an enterprise that'll get you the most bang for your buck across all the different compliance frameworks?
Two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication is usually a common, control across all different frameworks, and it does significantly mitigate risk. So I'd say that's definitely one for sure. Justin?
I'm going to go completely the other direction and avoid technical controls. And I think the most important thing, again, is management being involved in a lot of these frameworks. That is pretty much the first question is, does your security program have sponsorship from somebody that has the purse strings? Because like you said, all of this stuff takes money, takes time, takes resources. Without there being buy-in at the highest level and you being able to measure its effectiveness. So it's kind of one of those things, right? Executives need to give you the money. You as the implementers have to be able to prove its effectiveness because it is a cost center. So you have to show that, yeah, it cost us X, but the chances of a breach and or something bad happening was exponentially more than that. So from my perspective, it's always getting that buy-in and leadership. It's also the hardest one to sell to clients. So
I'm gonna listen to that as a different question in some respect as well, because you ask for the most bang for your buck as opposed to what's going to get you more compliant, and they're not the same thing. So why do we get compliant? So we can make, one of the reasons I like compliance, by the way, is because it puts checks and balances around our infrastructure team. One day a long time ago, it was me and John and Sammy, and then it was Michael, and there was 4 of us, and we knew that no one was opening RDP on the internet. We knew that our servers were patched because there was 5 servers, and that's what we did. Now we've got 5,000 servers, and we've got multiple data centers, and we've got lots of other things, lots of firewalls, lots of IP addresses, and lots of staff. And we knew staff weren't doing bad things. So I would say there's 3 things you should, if you've got to choose 3 things that will help with compliance, but also help with securing your environment. One, Ron's already said, dual factor authentication. That's a physical control that deals with the fact that users might get phished, users might get give their passwords away, and they might just create crap passwords. Right? And it's very hard to put physical control to stop crap passwords. You can make them long, you can't force them to stop being crap. The second thing I would say is don't allow software to run that isn't trusted. Block everything by default. Because if someone's going to get into your environment, they're going to do it through software or they're going to do it through credentials. So if we've used dual factor on credentials, ring fence them, don't let them run, both of them. I mean, if you don't let them run, that's better than ring fencing. I would say both, but definitely ring fence them if you have to let them run. We did an interesting report actually yesterday for a very large company. And one of the things ThreatLocker does when you onboard a trial with ThreatLocker right now, we're trying this new trial program, and we give you a report of what's running and the origin of that software. And just one company that deployed less than 2% of their endpoints were able to see communications with Russia, with China, Russian-based software running China. And it wasn't malware. It was just software that they didn't know was in their environment and could have compromised them. So our suggestion was very much, don't let this run if you don't need it. In many cases, it was coupon clippers and games and shit that shouldn't have been on the machine, excuse my language. The other side is ring fence it where it needs to run, because there was drivers on the machine that were written in China. And it's like, you need the driver, but limit what it can do. But the third thing is take away the control. Have someone penetration testing, whether you call it penetration testing or have someone try and get into your system from the outside. Because guess what? The moment your IT department screw up, and they will screw up at some point, and leave a port open and don't turn something on, they're going to come down and say, hey, look what we found open on your network. And you want that. And by the way, if you are a CEO of a company or you're a CIO and you've got enough people underneath you, you want to know about that. And when you ask your team, 100%, they're not always going to tell you the truth. And they're going to say yes. And their selective truth is the word they use. Yes, we don't allow RDP on this IP address, this IP address, and this IP address. Oh, but I'm allowed to RDP into this system here. So they're the three things I would be saying. And they all go to compliance as well. But I think from a security guy's point of view, from someone who spent their life getting into systems and trying to protect systems, they're the three things you need to focus on.
Yeah.
I'm going to go up with the fourth.
Go on.
Based on what you said. No, I mean, I think I would start with having a secure configuration built, because then adding all of these additional controls is just the icing on the cake. But knowing that you're starting from a good place, and again, this goes back to the CIS thing, looking at their kind of like benchmark standards. If your build starts there, then when you're adding these technical controls, you have that extra layer of confidence. And that's when we start talking about defense in depth.
And this is why we don't have free controls in compliance, because we can keep going on.
Right.
You know, interestingly, are you guys familiar with Essential 8, Australian guidance, regulation? No one's really sure.
No.
So the Australian government has something called Essential 8. So rather than the US government, they took a slightly different approach to getting people to implement cybersecurity controls. The US government says everyone should be doing NIST, everyone should be following these standards. And what happens is someone picks it up and goes, oh shit, I can't do that, and then walks away from it. The Australian government took a slightly different approach, and they said every company, and it's not legal, but it is in a respect in that someone got, and I explained a case that makes it law, but every company should implement these 8 controls. And they picked 8 controls. I think it was dual factor. It was actually stuff like disabling macros. It was using allow listing or whitelisting. It was there was 8 dual factor authentication. I don't know if I've already said that. There was 8. You can look them up. I can't remember them all. But there was 8 basic cybersecurity controls. Now, here's the thing. Everyone does them. Not everyone, but I mean, Australia is our second biggest market, and we're a US-based company. We hadn't set foot on the ground in Australia until last year. And before that, it was still our second biggest market, not a single person there. And the reason being is because every company, every small business said, we need these controls. And that's because that's what the government said. Now, it's not law, so they can't come and sue you if you don't put them in place, kind of. So a public company got sued for failing to disclose in their responsible disclosures that they hadn't implemented proper cybersecurity controls because they hadn't followed the Essential 8. So while it's not mandated by law, it's considered negligent if you haven't done it. So in any case where you leak data or you have your business crypto locked and your stock price goes down, or you hurt someone in the contract, you automatically become negligent because you failed to implement these controls. So while it's not a requirement, you won't get sued and you won't get fined for not doing it, you become the losing party in the case if something happens to your environment and you haven't done it. And the point of that is when you give someone, and we could be here going through all 70 or 80, 110 controls on NIST, which ones are more important? But when you start with 110, it's very hard to get through them. So what I would suggest is start with 5 or 8 or 10, do them, and then do the next 5 or 8 or 10. And start with the most, I think we've got a good few ones here with what's most important. Start with those most important ones first, and then start picking out the other ones. That gets you in a more secure state.
Absolutely.
We do have 2 things that are worth looking at. If you haven't already checked out ThreatLocker, sign up for a demo. We do a free trial, free demo. We'll walk you through the product. We'll show you how we can help with various controls in cybersecurity. It's very, very easy. And we've got over 40,000 companies using our products now. And they range from small local businesses. So if you think you're too small, I think we've got companies with a handful of users, right up to the US Navy, JetBlue, big companies, big organizations that use our products. And it's very, very easy and very simple. There's a link in the chat to book a demo. So please do a free demo. Check it out if you haven't already. In addition to that, every year we do a conference here in Orlando called Zero Trust World. The idea of this conference is to educate you on cybersecurity threats. We teach you on a business side, compliance side, but also on a technical side. Now, here's what happens at the beginning of every year conference. Everyone express their interest in what side if they want of security. About half the conference say they want business and half of them say technical. Now, the technical are labs. So we have hackers come in. We teach you how to break into systems using rubber duckies, how to hijack Wi-Fi, how to write malware, how to run malware, how to do all these cool things. And the business, we're going to talk more about compliance, how to pitch to your board, how to, if you're an MSP, how to talk to your customers. I'm going to show you that side. What always happens, half the people sign up for the business labs and then do the technical labs because they're much more fun. But if you haven't been to Zero Trust World, February 26th to 28th, 2024, it's here in Orlando. It's the best time to visit Orlando. It's a great few days. Last year, we had some great speakers in as well. We got world's most famous pickpocket. We got Captain Sully Burger and a bunch of other great speakers. So it's a great 3 days, really educational though. And you will come out knowing a lot more about how to secure things, basic things from Office 365 to servers than you went in.
And Danny, we were there last year, and I got to tell you, what a brilliant conference. The sessions were very eye-opening. There was some really good stuff. So, and I think we had our federal practice director in one of your panels that was talking about CMMC. So,
yes. So look, if you haven't been there before, it is really great. Great 3 days. Guys, do you want to finish out on any thoughts?
I think, again, if you have a secure environment, compliance is, a byproduct of that. So focus on those security controls, and compliance will follow suit. Again, it's all about documentation, right? We can have all the controls in place, but having those controls, like you said, Danny, when you did your SOC 2 and you had to change that policy, it went like this because you had to customize it to your specific environment. And we like to say that, our clients are like snowflakes. They all have different nuances when we start working with them. So those policies and procedures need to be custom designed to your specific environment.
Well, when you put policies in place as well, and I think when we went through our SOC 2, the security part was easy. The difficult part was the documentation, and it was more around documentation of the policy, because before we had a policy that said your passwords need to be strong and long, at least whatever number of characters. And now we have this really long defined policy that describes examples and of what is a weak password and what is a strong password.
You can always get a template package, right, for $3,000 or $4,000, and we've seen a lot of companies will just do paste, put their name in there, and then they're like, all right, we have policies, right? It's just cut and paste, but that's not the way that you build policies, right?
Yeah. Well, and look, you need to make sure that people understand the policy too, and they understand why it's there.
Exactly.
Best thing we invested was ThreatLocker University to train our staff on everything. So whenever we push a new feature out in ThreatLocker, a course gets assigned to our staff for that feature, and they have to take it. It's a 5-minute course, a 10-minute course. It doesn't matter. They have to take it. They have to test on it. And if we put a new policy, and it doesn't just come down to security, right down to we put a new policy on dishwasher usage in the kitchen. It goes into university, and everyone takes it's normally like a 2-minute course. It gets assigned to them. They run it. So, oh, I'm not allowed to leave my dishes in the sink. I didn't think that was a problem. But having a training platform is really useful to communicate things and make sure people know, especially as you get bigger and you've got lots of staff, and you can't just say, hey, stop doing that.
Exactly.
Guys, well, thank you very much for joining us today.